Something unprecedented just happened between the United States and Canada. And I don't use that word lightly. In the span of 72 hours, Washington escalated trade tensions with Ottawa to a level that hasn't been seen since the War of 1812. Tariffs, energy threats, frozen contracts, retaliatory countermeasures, all of it happening simultaneously. And the part that should concern every single person watching this, whether you live in Michigan or Manitoba, is that the economic fallout is already hitting your wallet. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and where this is heading. Let's start with the facts. The current U.S. administration announced a sweeping new round of trade actions targeting Canada. These aren't routine tariff adjustments. These are broad, aggressive measures invoking emergency trade authority, the kind of mechanism that's historically been reserved for adversarial nations, not for America's single largest trading partner. The scope is staggering. We're talking about punitive duties on Canadian aluminum, steel, lumber, dairy, and critically, energy products. Simultaneously, new restrictions were announced on Canadian business operations within U.S. financial institutions, including holds on cross-border settlement accounts and a suspension of expedited visa processing for Canadian executives. Now, to understand why this is so extraordinary, you need to understand the baseline. The United States and Canada conduct roughly $2.5 billion in bilateral trade every single day. Every day. That makes it the largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. The two economies aren't just connected. They're structurally fused. Auto parts cross the border 6, 7, sometimes 8 times during the assembly of a single vehicle. Energy infrastructure, pipelines, transmission lines, shared grids was built over decades with the explicit assumption that this relationship was permanent and stable. What Washington just did is take a sledgehammer to that assumption. And what Ottawa did next caught almost everyone off guard. Within hours of Washington's announcement, the Prime Minister delivered an emergency national address. Not a press release, not a background briefing, a direct televised address to the Canadian public. And the tone was unlike anything we've heard from a Canadian leader in modern memory. The message was clear, measured, and unmistakable. Canada will not absorb these measures quietly. Canada will respond with every tool at its disposal. And Canada has more tools than most people realize. Here's what was announced. First, Ottawa invoked national security provisions to place all Canadian energy exports to the United States under immediate government review. That includes crude oil, natural gas, refined petroleum products, and electricity. Canada supplies approximately 4 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. That is not a typo. 4 million barrels, that represents roughly half of total U.S. crude imports. Entire regions of the American economy, the Midwest, the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, depend on Canadian energy not as a preference, but as a structural necessity. Refineries in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Montana were literally designed to process Canadian heavy crude. They cannot simply switch suppliers. The infrastructure doesn't exist. Second, Ottawa announced a strategic review of critical mineral export permits. Canada is one of the world's top producers of lithium, cobalt, nickel, potash, and rare earth elements. These are the materials that go into electric vehicle batteries, semiconductor manufacturing, military electronics, and agricultural fertilizers. American industry doesn't just use these minerals. It cannot function without them at current production levels. Third, and this is the one that sent shockwaves through the transportation sector, Canada announced a comprehensive review of its airspace agreements with the United States. Canadian airspace is the primary corridor for American flights to Europe and Asia. If access were even partially curtailed, it would force massive rerouting. Industry analysts estimate this would add 2 to 4 hours to transatlantic flights and cost U.S. carriers somewhere in the range of $30 to $40 billion annually. What the Prime Minister effectively communicated to Washington was this: you may have the larger economy, but we hold leverage in areas where there are no easy substitutes. This isn't a bluff. These are structural dependencies that took decades to build and cannot be replicated in months. And the markets understood this immediately. Within the first trading session after these announcements, oil futures surged. Natural gas contracts spiked. U.S. airline stocks dropped sharply. Manufacturing companies with Canadian supply chain exposure saw significant sell-offs. The broader indices fell hard, the kind of single-day decline that makes retirement fund managers start fielding panicked phone calls. But here's the detail that tells you what sophisticated investors actually think about the balance of power in this dispute. Canadian markets stabilized faster than American ones. The Canadian dollar strengthened. Canadian energy stocks rose. The Toronto Exchange recovered while Wall Street was still bleeding. Global capital looked at this confrontation and made a judgment. Canada holds more cards than the market had priced in. That is a remarkable conclusion for investors to reach about a country with 1/10 the GDP of the United States. But it reflects a reality that pure GDP comparisons miss entirely. Leverage isn't about size. It's about dependency. And in this relationship, the dependencies run disproportionately in Canada's favor in precisely the sectors that matter most. Now, there's a reason Canada was able to respond this aggressively, and it didn't happen overnight. Over the past several years, Canadian policymakers have been quietly but systematically reducing the country's economic dependence on the American market. This has been happening across multiple sectors simultaneously, and most American analysts simply weren't paying attention. On the energy side, new pipeline capacity to Canada's Pacific coast has opened direct export routes to Asian markets. Long-term supply contracts have been signed with buyers in Japan, South Korea, and India. Domestic refining capacity has been expanded to reduce the need to ship raw crude south for processing and buy it back as finished product. On critical minerals, Canada has signed partnership agreements with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea to create integrated supply chains that bypass U.S. intermediaries entirely. These aren't memorandums of understanding or vague frameworks. These are binding commercial agreements with investment commitments and delivery timelines. On trade diversification more broadly, Canada has been aggressively expanding its network of free trade agreements. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, ongoing negotiations with India, the United Kingdom, and ASEAN member states. The strategic logic is straightforward. The more markets Canada can access independently, the less any single trading partner can use economic coercion as a weapon. And this is the part that should concern American strategic thinkers far more than the immediate tariff dispute. Because what Canada is building isn't just a defensive posture for this particular crisis. It's a permanent structural shift. Once these alternative supply chains are established, once these trade relationships mature, once Asian and European buyers have reliable access to Canadian resources, that business doesn't automatically come back to the United States when the political winds change. Markets don't work that way. Trust, once broken, gets replaced by contracts with other partners. This is the deeper consequence that gets lost in the day-to-day headlines. The United States isn't just risking a trade dispute. It's risking permanent erosion of preferential access to Canadian resources that American industry has taken for granted for generations. Let's talk about the domestic political dynamics, because this is where the strategic miscalculation becomes most visible. The states most exposed to Canadian trade disruption are not abstract economic zones. They are politically critical battleground states. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Ohio, Montana. These are states where elections are decided by tens of thousands of votes and where hundreds of thousands of jobs are directly tied to cross-border commerce with Canada. Michigan alone conducts well over $100 billion in annual trade with Canada. The auto industry in that state is functionally binational. You cannot build a car in Detroit without parts that cross the Canadian border multiple times. When Canadian countermeasures threaten to disrupt that supply chain, you're not talking about abstract economic modeling. You're talking about assembly lines shutting down, workers being sent home, dealerships running out of inventory. The political response in these states has been swift and bipartisan. Governors, legislators, and business associations have publicly called for de-escalation. Local chambers of commerce are running advocacy campaigns. Agricultural groups are warning about fertilizer shortages and planting season disruptions. Polling in border states shows overwhelming opposition to the current trade posture. Numbers that cross party lines in a way that very few policy issues do anymore. When a family in northern Minnesota is looking at the possibility of their heating bill doubling next winter, partisan loyalty takes a back seat to economic survival. And this creates an extraordinarily difficult political problem. The administration walked into this confrontation expecting it to play a strength. Instead, it's creating visible economic pain in precisely the communities that were supposed to be the political base. That's not a sustainable position. The question is whether the political pressure builds fast enough to force a course correction before the economic damage becomes entrenched. There's also a significant legal dimension to this that deserves attention. The trade agreement currently governing U.S.-Canada commerce, the agreement that the current administration itself negotiated and signed, contains explicit dispute resolution mechanisms. These mechanisms exist precisely to prevent the kind of unilateral escalation we're witnessing. By bypassing those procedures and invoking emergency trade authority instead, Washington has created a substantial legal vulnerability. Canada has already initiated formal challenges through the agreement's dispute resolution process and at the World Trade Organization. Trade law experts, including several who are politically sympathetic to the current administration, have assessed that the legal justification for these measures is extremely weak. The policies being targeted as unfair trade practices are in most cases policies that have already been reviewed and found compliant by international trade bodies. The practical implication is that the United States is likely to lose these cases, which means the tariffs will eventually need to be withdrawn. But the economic damage, the supply chain disruptions, the broken contracts, the lost business relationships, all of that will have already occurred. You end up in the worst possible position, having suffered all the costs of a trade war while ultimately being forced to concede the legal argument. So where does this end? There are essentially three scenarios. The first is rapid de-escalation. Business pressure, market signals, and political backlash in key states force a quick reversal. Some face-saving language is deployed, the most aggressive measures are quietly shelved, and both sides agree to return to established dispute resolution channels. This is the best-case scenario for both economies, and the one that rational self-interest would dictate. The second scenario is prolonged escalation. The tariffs go into effect. Canada implements its countermeasures, energy restrictions, mineral export controls, airspace reviews. American consumers see immediate price increases. Canadian producers absorb short-term losses, but accelerate their pivot to alternative markets. The economic pain mounts on both sides, but disproportionately hits American consumers and businesses in the near term because of the dependency asymmetries we've discussed. This scenario could last months and cause lasting damage to cross-border economic integration. The third scenario, and the one that genuinely worries strategic analysts, is structural decoupling. If this confrontation drags on long enough, the temporary trade diversification measures that Canada is implementing become permanent. European and Asian buyers lock in long-term contracts for Canadian energy and minerals. Cross-border supply chains get redesigned to reduce American exposure. The economic architecture that has made North America the most integrated market on Earth begins to fragment. That third scenario doesn't just hurt both countries economically. It fundamentally weakens the Western alliance at a moment when geopolitical competition with China and instability in multiple regions make North American unity more strategically important than it's been in decades. Here's the bottom line. The United States and Canada built the most successful bilateral economic relationship in human history. Not because it was easy and not because there were never disagreements. They built it because both countries understood that their prosperity, their security, and their influence in the world were stronger together than apart. What's happening right now puts all of that at risk, not because of some unavoidable clash of national interests, but because of a calculated political decision to treat a trusted ally like an adversary. The economic data is clear, the strategic analysis is clear, the legal exposure is clear. The only question left is whether common sense prevails before the damage becomes irreversible. If this story matters to you, and if you live in either country, it should, share it. The more people understand what's actually at stake, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend this is just business as usual. I'll be covering every development as this unfolds. Thanks for watching.